Hi, this video is for reading 15, and it is entitled, Who Am I? And the author is Who Am I? Race, Ethnicity, and Identity. And the author is Hazel Rose Marcus. So this reading opens up with the author kind of posing a opening question to the readers. The question of who am I? So, consider how you would answer that question, or perhaps how you maybe would have answered that question before doing this reading. The author reveals that this is oftentimes a question that she poses in her introductory psychology classes, and she gives some examples of how students respond. And you can see those on page 168. This one student says, I am motivated, responsible, caring, serious, intelligent, with many diverse interests, like to play Halo, tired from studying, Asian American. Another person says, I am tall, male, biracial, motivated when I need to be, but certainly not all the time. A leader when I want to be, but it is fun to follow. I am nice, carefree, a huge slob, and most importantly, rarely serious. I'm going to apply to law school. And so the cool thing about that question, who am I, is it taps into the concepts of selves or identities. And Marcus, refers to Descartes, who has, of course, the often quoted, sometimes misquoted, I think, therefore I am. But she emphasizes that this is only half true, especially from the perspective of social psychologists, because it is also the case that you think, therefore I am, referring to the role of other people in the process of developing and understanding your own self, your own identity. And so this really just speaks to the fact that social processes definitely contribute towards identity. And she kind of briefly mentions social psychologist Mead and Cooley, but I'm going to talk a little bit more about the social psychological perspective of self, and particularly the contributions of Mead and Cooley in the next couple of slides. So self is the distinct identity that sets one apart from others. It's part of an individual's personality, and it is composed of self-awareness and self-image, right? It is how we think of, conceive, perceive ourselves. And so for social psychologists, a big question is, how do we know who we are? How does the who we are even develop? And so social psychology is a really cool discipline because it is a focus that a person can have, whether their discipline is primarily sociology or primarily psychology. Generally speaking, and I am speaking in kind of big, broad kind of generalizations here. Oftentimes, if you come at social psychology from the psychologist side, you see self as more of a private possession. You see it as being rooted in and reflective in individuals' personality and personality characteristics. And that this self is comprised of enduring traits, beliefs, values, motives, and dispositions. So it's this idea you are who you are, and that's largely going to more or less endure across your lifetime and across different social contexts. So sociologists, on the other hand, see the self as being more fundamentally social in nature, and that the concept of self is acquired and maintained through your social relationships. And because of that, that means that the self is fluid and it can change over time and across situations. And it's worth noting that although Marcus identifies herself as a psychologist, certainly she seems like she is approaching it from more of this more sociological background or perspective. So let's kind of briefly highlight some of the theories or theorists that she discusses or name checks in her reading. One of them is Charles Cooley. And so Charles Cooley developed this concept of the looking glass self, and he actually developed it by watching his own children kind of play, because he noticed that children learn to judge themselves based on how they imagine others are going to react to them. And so in this way, Other people serve as a mirror to them, and this helps them develop their concept of self. And we continue this even into adulthood. And it is that idea that other people serve as a mirror. That's how the concept gets its name, looking glass self. And so the looking glass self is the self concept based on what you believe others think of you. And before I go through kind of the 3 steps that make up the concept, just know that you selectively interpret people's views. There are people's views that more or less matter. So some mirrors are more important than other mirrors. And then sometimes you misinterpret a person's evaluation. So the self concept that you develop in relation to that evaluation, of course, could be false. But in general, the looking glass self development process is comprised of 3 steps. We imagine how we appear to others. We then interpret others' reactions to us. And then we use that information to form, to revise, to refine our self concept. So just to kind of provide an example, right? So let's say I imagine that I am funny, but whenever I tell jokes to like my students or on dates, people don't really laugh, or they give that really awkward laugh where it's clear they don't necessarily find me funny. So I would have to, unless I'm totally just delusional, I would have to take that feedback and I would have to use it to refine my self concept. So maybe I'm not that funny, or maybe I have the type of humor that only, some people appreciate in certain settings. So that is what that kind of 3-step process looks like. The other theorist that she name checks in this section is George Herbert Mead, and he is a social psychologist who's associated with the theory of the social self, and it's kind of right there in the name. But basically, he's claiming that the self only develops through social experience. That to develop a self, this requires imagining situations from other people's point of view, which he calls taking the role of the other. And the other can be significant others, people you really know in your own life who matter to you. But also the other can be what he calls the generalized other. And this is kind of the general viewpoint and perspective of larger society. And it's by taking this role of the other that we become more self-aware, and we develop what he says, kind of 2 components of ourself. There's the I. This is our impulse to act. This is our kind of more natural, unsocialized self that is, maybe more creative or innovative, but is certainly more unthinking and unpredictable. This is who we are when no one is around to watch us or check our behavior, and we don't have to be concerned about social repercussions. And then there is the me. This is the part of ourselves, that others see us. This is our self-awareness of what is expected of us from larger society. And so this part of us is usually more conforming and upholds social conventions. The me usually controls the I, especially as we get older. We become concerned about what people will think, and we kind of shape ourselves to meet these larger social conventions. And we kind of check some of our more unpredictable, unacceptable habits and characteristics and traits. And, to take this a step further, Mead also kind of related this to age and stages of development. Children under the age of self, under the age of 3, they don't really have a clear sense of self. Largely because they aren't able to kind of take on this role of the other. They don't have self-awareness about who they are because they don't have the language skills, as well as just, the developmental skills to kind of see themselves through the eyes of others. And so at this age, it is their I, just their kind of natural impulses, some of the kind of ingrained personality characteristics that they were born with, that's kind of running rampant, right? They are who they are, despite maybe, their parents' best efforts. Think about a toddler that's pitching a tantrum in a public setting. They don't care anything about public opinion. Between the ages of 3 to 6, they started to become more aware about what is expected of them in society, and they become better about taking on the role of others. But particularly the significant others. So they do things kind of based on, what their mom or dad would want them to do. They imitate big brother, big sister, they follow the rules to make, their teacher happy. So it's their significant others who they are kind of considering. Then somewhere, after the age of 6, they enter into the phase where they develop the ability to consider the generalized other, right? What does larger society expect of them? What is considered good behavior, and why people should uphold good behavior, not just because of fear of consequences or upsetting significant others, right? That you should follow social conventions because you're supposed to. And it is as they kind of move into this stage where their me becomes more fully developed, and they kind of develop that more adult sense of self, where oftentimes your me overrides your I in most settings and situations. So that's just a little bit of background, so you can kind of understand the social psychological components of this essay. Before we even get into the race, the discussion of race that Marcus offers, she, goes over what she feels like are kind of 3 key attributes about identities. That identities are where self meets society, identities are dynamic, and identities are unique. So I'm not going to necessarily go over all of these aspects of the reading, but just a couple of key points. Under the identities or where self meets society, there are some parts of your identity that are more, related to individual choice and freedom. So some things kind of related to your activities, your past and present, future states, your hopes and fears. You do have a good deal of freedom, flexibility, and choice in regards to those aspects of your identity. But some aspects of our identity are given to us. This is society's kind of established list of who we are. And this is that concept of social location that has come up before in other readings. And so, this speaks to the fact that part of the answer to that question, who am I, does involve other people. So they can affirm or deny how we would like to be seen, as well as they can also impose their own set of labels. They can identify you, they can define you, and we'll talk at the end, about what do you necessarily do with that feedback. Identities are dynamic just emphasizes that context influences identities, and this is both temporal and spatial. So, specific times, your identity can change based on specific times in your life, as well as spatial context, based on exactly, where you are and who you are surrounded with. And then the final kind of point, just, about identities, generally speaking, is that they are unique because they are this joint project between self and other people around you, and that they can change over time and environments. This means that, your identity is unlikely to overlap with someone else's. It is unique to you. All right. So that is kind of our general points about identity. So, how does this relate to race? Because you maybe read these first few pages like, why did she assign this during the race, the race module? Well, it's right there on page 171. In sum, identities are complex, dynamic, and unique. In addition, and most notably for a volume on doing race, they are social and depend on context. In other words, they are both private and public property. If a social category matters in a given community, and if a person claims an association with this category, or if others associate them with this category is going to have an impact on their behavior. And so this is setting a stage for, why racial identity is important in the US, whether individuals maybe even want or choose for that identity, to be important. So we begin with a discussion of what she calls the behavioral significance of identity, and this is that part where she's discussing that figure, the society, identity, behavior, society cycle. And it's just this idea that, of course, through our individual experiences and identities, we develop frameworks of meaning and value, which she refers to as schemas, and they help us make sense of the world. And then these schemas can also influence behaviors. So race and ethnicity in the US is just kind of a
an important source of identity. In the US, everyday life is powerfully shaped by race and ethnicity. That's the author's claim there on page 173. And so not everyone agrees with this, but one thing we know through sociological research is the extent to which you realize race and ethnicity matter is likely connected to your own racial and ethnic status. So minorities, by nature of them being minorities, are oftentimes more aware of the significance of race and ethnicities, of race and ethnicity. Majority group members who are non-white Hispanics in this country are less likely to be aware. Although it's worth noting that as majority group members become less of the numeric majority, which isn't the same thing as them still being, part of the majority / dominant group. But if they become less of the numeric majority, this does tend to shift their perception and awareness around race and ethnicity. And so I give you this little map, and it's already, kind of 7 years dated. But it just kind of shows you that there are some parts of the country where the numeric majority is not the actual dominant white non-Hispanic group. So if you were to speak to people who identify as white non-Hispanic in those areas, they probably have a greater awareness and sense of race and ethnicity and how they might impact people's daily lives, more so than people who are in areas that are in fact largely white non-Hispanic, and where most of the people share the same racial and ethnic identity. And so, it's just worth noting, going back to a person we've discussed in previous readings, Peggy McIntosh, one of the things that she did say in her essay on white privilege is it is a form of white privilege to be able to ignore race or to say you're beyond race. This is something that racial minorities rarely have the option to do. Um, Defining race and identity, she notes, that these definitions, once again, are based on time and place. Like some other readings, she notes that, it's not synonymous, but these definitions can or do overlap. I do encourage you to really consider how she distinguishes the two on page 174, because she offers a fairly unique definition where she heavily based on the concept of power and power relations that is unlike the definitions that, have solely kind of been based on like phenotype versus shared cultural traits that have been given in previous readings. And so, if going off of those definitions of race and ethnicity, when and how does race and ethnicity matter? So first of all, she's very clear, racial and ethnic identities aren't only a source of division or prejudice. They can be a source of pride, of meaning, of motivation and belongingness. So when people, push to say, oh, we need to live in a society where race doesn't matter, well, we need to clarify that, because race mattering doesn't necessarily mean that it is a bad thing. Something can remain meaningful to individuals as an identity, but not necessarily be meaningful in a larger societal sense where, because of this identity, you are a victim of prejudice or discrimination. So it just kind of ends by making it clear that, what type of influence race and ethnicity have on identity. And the key word there, of course, is influence and not determine, because this isn't like a perfect causal relationship. In those final pages, 175 to 176, she really just emphasizes that people can kind of claim, enthusiastically, impassionedly their racial ethnic identity, or they can kind of actively resist trying to have that identity be a real significant part of their identity. But in a society where race and ethnicity matter, they can't escape all influence of racial and ethnic identities, largely because it probably will remain a lens through which people see, perceive, and treat them. So it's impossible to fully ignore. And so that is it for this reading on Marcus, Who Am I?